Welcome to Access Zen with Gregory Foster. Our program will help you set a more perfect balance between your inner world and the outside world. And now, here's your host, Gregory Foster.
Well, good morning, everyone. How's it going today? Another Thursday? Anyways, thanks for having us back, and also want to give a quick shout out to all the great new listeners who are on the show, and I really appreciate your support. So I'm Gregory Foster. You're listening to Access Zen, and today we have just an absolutely amazing show. Theme of today's show is Hearts and Mind, from teen runaway to fashion romance and rock and roll. Lorelei Shellist will be coming on here in a few minutes, and she's got just a sensational book called Runway, Runaway, and it's kind of all of her journey and story with the Eagles and Def Leppard, and her being on as a fashion runway model, and also her incredible story as being a bit of a teen runaway from age 15. So we're going to get to that in about a few minutes, but I wanted to just share with the listeners what Lorelei and I did actually this past week, coincidentally, the Freedom to Choose Prison Project, and that's where both of us were from Thursday through Sunday. And so, I just have to say what an absolute blessing it is to have the opportunity to be of service to someone else. And I just want to say again, being of service is probably the highest calling we as humans can ever do. And it goes both ways. And I'm not sure, in our time with the ladies up in Chowchilla, up at the Valley State Prison, I'm not sure who was in more service. Did I serve them or did they serve me? Because I have to tell you the blessings that, and I'm sure Lorelei will speak to that when she comes on, but I just have to say, working with them in that room, which is a gymnasium of about 400 ladies. It's a maximum security prison, and we get to spend essentially 3 days together. And it's all about, working through how to listen effectively, how to perception check. And one of the things that kind of jumped out at me is just how valuable it was for them to be heard. Because when they're going through their daily lives and even before they, whatever circumstances led them to being incarcerated, a lot of them have never really ever been heard. And by heard, I mean being able to say where they're coming from and, from a heart-centered perspective, and have another human being actually be able to listen to what they're saying. So it's just absolutely, incredible. So I wanted to just give a special thanks out to Bonnie and David, also to Lance and Nancy, who kind of put everything together, and to all the volunteers from the University of Santa Monica that I had the incredible pleasure of working with. There was about 70 of us, and all of the wonderful ladies from the Valley State Prison. Special shout out to my sound guys, Ezra and Edward. We just had a blast on the sound, and we'll tell you more about that as we get through today's episode. So I just wanted to again say, please, listeners, it's just make sure you take the time to go out and listen and watch the video. freedomtochoose.net. Type that into your browser. It won a major award at the Cannes Film Festival last year. But if you go to simply type into your browser freedomtochoose.net, you'll get a chance to actually see the video that was filmed inside the prison, and you'll have a very good opportunity to see the kind of work that Lorelei and I do in the prison. So that's kind of what we got coming up. One of the prisoners that you'll see in that video, her name is Rhonda, and she's kind of the one that kind of kicked this whole thing off. So you'll see her, and I actually had a chance to spend some time with her up there, and she's actually planning on coming on a show soon, so stay tuned for that. All right, well, today's show with Lorelei, she's going to be coming on and telling her amazing journey as an international fashion model in that industry, and also, obviously, as we talked about, one of the volunteers. So she's got just an incredible life story to tell us. And Lorelei, how are you doing this morning?
Good morning, Greg. Oh, still waking up. It's not even light out here in California. It's like blue skies out there.
I know, and it's starting to warm up.
Yes. And I was down at the beach yesterday, running on the beach, and feeling so grateful to be here, especially after we had so much rain up at the prison last week. It was cold and rainy.
It sure was. It was, but it was kind of fitting because when it's rainy like that, it kind of helps me go within and, be able to get a good sense of myself and helps me ground in some ways. I know that sounds unusual, but that kind of works for me,
It's very cleansing. And it was an awesome experience, and it's always wonderful to see you there. I remember one time at the prison where you and I ended up in trio together with someone. I think it was about 6 months or a year ago when we went?
I think it was a year ago.
Yeah, I really connected with you on that day. And I know how much your presence there mattered to the women there in the prison. I love hearing from the women in the prison about how healing it is for them when men come and do the service work, where men are working with their hearts. Because the feedback, a lot of the feedback that I heard from the women who shared was that it was the first time they were able to experience being in a situation with a man where they were not afraid and they didn't feel threatened.
Wow.
You remember that?
I do, and I still remember it. Every time I go up there, that what you say is I'm reminded of that.
Yeah. Most of those women, and people don't realize this, but, we were in one of the largest maximum security prisons in the country. And those women in there are murderers, and they're in there for manslaughter, and they're in there for whatever, larceny, whatever. But from what I get in the experience when I talk with these women, is that most of them are in there for self-defense crimes, crimes of self-defense.
Or being in the wrong place with the wrong person at the wrong time, right?
Exactly, yeah. In a sense, they're the victims, and yet they're taking the blame. But it's like they're the victims from way back before they ever even did their crimes. You know what I'm saying?
I do.
So, and once I hear their stories and I get their backgrounds, and I learned their things that have happened to them in their life. It's just no wonder they're in there. In fact, in many ways, it seems as if they're safer in there than they were where they came from.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you listen to the video, you'll hear a lot of those stories of, the things that happen to them on the outside, and it's the culture they live in and the environment they live in that really kind of puts them as you say, in harm's way.
Yeah. And they're beautiful. And sharing with them when we do our processes, our counseling processes, they are always amazed to hear from me, and I'm sure this is, I won't speak for you, but I would imagine it's the same for all of us, is that our deep inner hurts and fears are really universal, no matter what our backgrounds are.
Yeah, I've always found that to be true. I wasn't able to do quite as many trios this past weekend because I was on the sound, which, my intention going in was to be of joy and peace, and certainly had the opportunity to have a lot of fun and really spread that. But I was able to be in a few trios, and that really, still rings true for me, is how quickly I forget, where I'm at. I forget I'm in a prison. It's just talking to another person, another valuable human being, right?
Yes. Well, doing the work with those women, it's like the fast track to healing, because they have nothing to lose. There is nothing superficial about them. They have nothing. They don't, that they can hide behind. They're not hiding behind their jobs, their careers, their cars, their houses, their clothes, their jewelry, their money. They have nothing. It's just raw. They are what they are. They are who they are. They are where they are, and that's where they start. Right at the rawness of their hearts, at the cores of their hearts. And so they get right to the business of trying to heal whatever it is, whatever part of them has pretty much gotten them there. And also just getting by on a daily basis in that world, in there. That's their world. That's what they experience on a daily basis, and the things that happen in the prison. It's like it's hard in there as it's hard out here. It's whatever we choose to make it. And that's
So
the whole
true.
point of the workshop. How do we choose? The freedom to choose what we're going to make of our situations.
So, Lorelei, thank you. We're going to be going on a break here in about 30 seconds for about a couple of minutes. And when we come back, let's pick up where we're leaving off here. And then I want you to tell us your story, hearts and minds from teen runaway to fashion, romance, and rock and roll. And your book, Runway, Runaway. I'm Gregory Foster, and you're listening to Access Zen.
And now, let's return to Access Zen.
And we're back. And I'm on live here. I'm Gregory Foster with Access Zen, and you're listening to Lorelei Shellist. Lorelei, how's everything going so far today?
Well, everything's going really well. It's early day, so anything's possible from here on out.
Well, that's what we like to hear. So I know our listeners, I will tell you absolutely that, when we did some promotion on the show, there's a lot of Def Leppard fans out there. And I know you spent a lot of time with the Eagles, and I know you were a, wonderful fashion runway model. But I want the listeners to know that my experience of Lorelei is primarily just as Lorelei. I don't even think I knew you had a book until probably like just before graduation. I've had a chance to read it, and I will tell the listeners her book is called Runway, Runaway. It's a backstage pass to fashion, romance, and rock and roll, which is similar to our theme today. And it's a wonderful book. It basically, if you look at some of the chapter headings on the book, she has songs that actually double as a title of her book, and it tells her story. And you're going to get into that in a second. How you basically became you ran away from home at what, age 15? Is that right?
Yeah, just barely.
So I know our listeners are going, well, tell us about that.
Well, I was lucky. I knew what I wanted to do. There were two things I wanted to do when I was a little girl. One was to be a model, and the other was to be a social worker.
Oh.
So, isn't that fitting that I would be doing service work at this point in my life? So I got to do both. And I was blessed because I knew what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, my parents weren't really paying attention to my intentions. They knew that I really wanted to be a model, but they didn't take it seriously that I would do anything to follow my dream. And so when it came time for me to be at the age to be able to do that, they up and moved away. And I, in protest, ran away. And so and it's interesting because, even though I chose that experience, the result of it was ended to be a lot of inner healing that I'm still doing, that I was even doing this weekend in the prison. The feeling of not being supported, not being heard, and then going for it anyway. It's sort of like the stiff upper lip attitude, and that's what got me through it.
Now, you grew up in Santa Monica, right?
I can do this.
You grew up in Santa Monica, California, right?
Pacific Palisades.
Pacific Palisades. So
Which
I'm
is
just
a lovely
trying
place. You wouldn't. Most people wouldn't run away from the Pacific Palisades. Maybe
Yeah.
the Pacific Palisades.
That's a great life. And I want to, acknowledge you because that is a very prevalent theme inside the prison, as I talked about at the top of the hour, and you're mentioning here. You didn't feel heard by your family.
Yes, they didn't take me seriously. It was it's a respect. It's a matter of mutual respect.
Now, there's probably, millions of teenage women out there who live in beautiful homes like that who feel that way, and they don't run away.
Well, maybe they're not as headstrong. But I knew what I wanted to do. And so, and then, it became, once I ran away, then following my dream became more about survival. I needed to make money. I needed to live. I needed to pay bills. I needed to put gas in my car. So I began by I was working 3 jobs and trying to finish high school at the time. And so it's all written. The story is written where I went and where I lived. I lived down in the pit in Topanga Canyon with the hippies. I lived, in people's attics. I just moved around until I finally got an apartment, and then it sort of went from there. And I was out in the world, so I was exposed to meeting lots of people. And that's what led me to the meeting of Don Henley and into that whole SoCal rock and roll scene in the 70s here in Los Angeles. And then once I met him and, all the people around him, that became my world, and that's how I began to know more and more people in my career as a model here in Los Angeles. And then I ran away to New York and became more serious about it. And then I ran from New York over to Europe, and I lived in Europe for 10 years. And that's where I met Steve.
That is just an incredible. So you really have had just an absolute, in some ways, a dream life. As you said, growing up in Southern California and hanging out with Don Henley and Eagles. I mean, who wouldn't, want that kind of a life, right?
I know, and it was fun because, he used to let me drive his car when I was 16, and I didn't even have a license, but he didn't know it. I was driving his brand new BMW and picking up hitchhikers on Sunset Boulevard, but it was the 70s. That's what you did.
Touché.
There were a lot of fun parts about it, but there was a lot of danger too. But I didn't consider that it was dangerous what I was doing.
How did you get discovered? What was that process like?
Well, that's a really great thing, and that's one of the reasons why I wrote my book. I wasn't discovered. I was never discovered. I discovered me. I mean, out of sheer will and fortitude, because like I said, I was a survivor. Nobody said, "Oh, hey, you should be a model. Here's the doorway. We're going to make you a star." And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to share my story. I knocked on doors and I got turned down a lot. I mean, everyone, yes, I had all the, measurements and the height and, I was pretty enough, but, it takes more than that. It also takes just, being in the right place at the right time and being accepted by the right people and I wasn't really involved in any cliques or, I didn't know, agents that were going to, scoop me up and take care of me. So I knocked on doors and until they opened. And sometimes I had to go back and knock again. It happened to me with both my first agencies here in Los Angeles, with the Mary Webb Davis agency. When I went in there the first time, she looked at me and said, "Oh, you need braces. Come back when you get braces." And she sent me away. And I remember sitting on La Cienega in my little Carmen Ghia and just in tears, thinking, oh my God, I can't even get an agent. And I had been working towards that, getting my book together and getting all my pictures. And I tell that story in the book about how I dealt with my first rejection. And then in the end, I went back to her agency and she had hired the new guy that ran the print division and he took me right away. And I never got braces. Maybe during that couple of months, when you're 15 years old, your teeth are bigger than your face.
Yeah, and then being out on your own, so you're really your own support system at that point, right?
Yeah, and then when I went to New York and met with Eileen Ford, the first time I met her, she said, "Oh yes, I want you right now." And I said, "Well, I have to go back to LA and sell my car and get rid of my apartment and things like that, and then I'll be back." And when I came back, she couldn't remember who I was, and she refused to take me.
Oh my goodness!
So there I was again, going, "Are you kidding me? You told me you were going to take me, and I just sold my car, and I just drove across country, and I have nowhere to go, and you told me you wanted me," and I just sort of stamped my foot and said, "You have to." And once they realized how determined and serious I was, they knew that I was going to show up for work. And that's part of the battle for, agents and models. It's one thing to be pretty and be offered positions, but it's another thing for the girl to actually get up and go. They have to be able to count on you to do your job.
Exactly. So Lorelei, it sounds like to me that you really had a really powerful intention from a very early age, and you really kind of created your own ideal scene and then acted it out perfectly.
That's absolutely true, Greg. Yeah. And, you know, as a matter of fact, and, you know, I was a soul seeker from way back, and even when I was a teenager, once I did get into the business and I was on a roll, I actually drew, you talk about ideal scenes, and this is great for everyone out there who doesn't know what ideal scenes are. It's sort of where we write down and we get very clear about the things that we want. And what I did was I read a book called Creative Visualization when I was about 17, and by Shakti Gawain. She was one of the forerunners in ideal scenes, and I did her workbook, and I drew, she had what you called treasure maps, and I drew a treasure map of all the places in the world that I wanted to go and work as a model.
Wow.
So I had a geographical map of where I wanted to go, and that's what I did. I worked all over the world. My interest in being a model was really adventure, to see the world, and modeling was my vehicle that I was lucky enough to have. You know, there are other ways to see the world. You can go through the Marine Corps, you can go through the Red Cross, you can go through, you know, Habitat for Humanity. There are many ways to use, you know, to have a vehicle to see the world. So modeling happened to be mine.
And that's primarily, again, I remember, you know, reading the book and you kind of talking about that's kind of how the reason why rock stars and models are together is partly because of the scheduling. They're kind of in the same place at the same time. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. We travel in the same circles. And, you know, everyone starts out young and impressionable and vulnerable, and the next thing you know, you're having success and you've got money in the bank, and then all of a sudden the people that you grew up with can't relate to you because they don't have those things yet. Maybe they're still living at home with their parents, or they're still figuring out what they want to do, or they're still in college. And so all of a sudden, who do you hang out with, right? Mm-hmm. And also the promoters and the agents, they're all kind of like a little mafia. They all know each other, and you know, the promoters get the agents to provide girls at their parties, and the agents, you know, use businessmen and promoters and rock stars to provide the parties for their girls. So they're sort of filling each other's niches, in a sense. So they put us all together in the same place, and we coexist. And the one thread that we have in common is that we're pretty lonely, because all of a sudden we're living this fast life, and we're far away from home. So we become each other's saving graces.
Beautiful. Tell us a little bit about your on and off relationship with Don Henley, and then I want to get to kind of the crux of the story with Steve Clark.
Okay. Well, the on part was we were an item together for about a year from when I was around 16 to 17, and that was before I moved to New York. And what brought us together was he tried to hit on me at the record plant when they were recording one of these nights, and I wasn't interested in going out with him, and he had to try a little harder, and it turned out he was into photography and he knew some people, so he offered to help me to introduce me to some people and get some pictures taken for my modeling career. So that's what perked my interest, and that's what brought us together. And then he was older than me at the time. He was 11 years older than me, and it didn't seem like a lot to us at the time. And in all fairness to him, I probably told him I was 18. So, you know, he thought I was older than I was, because I told everyone I was older than I was, because I did that at work. You know, I had to do that to get jobs and things like that. And also, everyone I knew was older than me, so I was trying to act as if I was older. So then, so we had fun together, and then when I moved to New York, we just remained friends. And then every summer after that, for years, I would come home to California, and then we would see each other again. So we had a long friendship and a long romance, but we were only really an item for about a year. And then when I moved over to Milan first, and I spent about a year in Milan, and then I moved over to Paris. And during that time, I was friends with the manager of Def Leppard, one of the managers of the band Def Leppard. But I had been living over in Europe for a few years, and I wasn't really up to speed on Def Leppard or their music or anything like that. The only reason I knew who they were was because I knew their manager. And their manager had even invited me to come to one of their shows when they played at Bercy in Paris. And I refused to go because I didn't think I was going to like the music. And I was busy. I was working and I was busy, and I was like, whatever. Let's have lunch, but I didn't have time to go to the show. And he was like, "Are you kidding me? These are my babies. You got to come and meet my boys." And I said, "Peter, I really, maybe next time." And so
you'd kind of had your fill of rock stars at that point, right?
I had, I really had. I was done with musicians was sort of my attitude, and I had dated others, and I was more on a mission to follow my career at that time, because then finally, you asked about my getting discovered. Well, I was finally getting at a place where I was getting some recognition, and it took me and I was about 23 at the time, so it took me about 8 or 9 years before I got to the place where Karl Lagerfeld, who was designing for Chanel at the time, actually picked me up. And once Karl Lagerfeld paid attention to me, all of a sudden all the other designers in Paris wanted to know who I was. And so I was considered Karl Lagerfeld's new discovery. I said, well,
wow.
That's pretty ironic. I've been discovered after 8 years. And so I was signed under contract at Chanel. That was my first contract with a major design firm, and then it took off from there. And I went on to be signed under contract to other great designers, Yves Saint Laurent, who was considered the king of fashion at the time, which was like a really big feather in my cap. And then Christian Lacroix and Emmanuel Ungaro and different other, and then in Italy we had Giorgio Armani and the other really big designers. So I was really just at, hitting my peak, and I was on a roll. And that's when I got the phone call from Def Leppard's manager, Peter Manchin. He said, two of my boys are coming to Paris for a couple of weeks for a break, and I need you to show them around. And I said, "Oh, Peter, I don't have time, and he talked me into it. And that's how I met Steve. And I had no idea that when I met Steve, we were going to fall in love. In fact, it was like one of these things. I was dreading the appointment. He was dreading the appointment. He was like thinking, oh, American models, and they had just come off the photograph tour where they had been mauled by girls all over America. And, the last thing, he wanted to know about was like an American girl. He was used to this sort of, and so when we met, first of all, it was just love at first sight. And then, second of all, he was impressed that I didn't even know who he was, what instrument he played. I had never heard their music. And so it was refreshing to him. He felt like he was being seen for who he was and not just what he did for a living. And so that was our first connection. And it took off from there. We were together for 7 years. And
so let me ask you this.
Go ahead.
We talked about, creating visualizations, like what we call ideal scenes in our lives. Did you have one in there for meeting the love of your life as well?
At the time, no, I wasn't looking. I really was at a place where I had been, when you're a model and you're being thrown around out there with, for lack of better words, playboys and jet-setter type men, I became jaded pretty quickly because I realized we were pawns. We were sort of like little fish thrown in a piranha tank. When it came to the men over there, they were older men, they were powerful men, and they just wanted to get next to pretty girls. So they would align themselves to be able to do that. So we spent a lot of our time protecting ourselves against them. Some girls were, used those men to their own advantages, and so then it worked both ways, but I wasn't interested in that.
So clearly, Steve Clark, different kind of guy, right?
Yes, he didn't need me for to further his career. He didn't need me to satisfy his whims. You know, he wasn't going to use me to enhance his own power. It was just, we were just two kids, like I said earlier in the show. We were just two young people. We were both like about 23 years old. We were, you know, living this fast life out in the world. We, you know, people treated us differently back home because now we had made something of our lives. And so we were, you know, what we had in common was that we were both sort of in the same places in our individual careers, and we could afford to go out and do things like travel and things like that. And yet we were far away from home, so we became each other's home. We became each other's comfort zone.
So a real love connection and real family, right?
Yeah, we created our own family. And his best friend, Phil, they were the Terror Twins, and Phil fell in love with my roommate, who was my best friend in the whole world. She was my Terror Twin. They used to call us, you know, Lucy and Ethel. And so the four of us were a unit, and the four of us would travel together and live together and have fun together. And it was really, really great. It was really great fun. We were a family.
So clearly, you're sorry, cut you off there. You are in the peak of one of the greatest, you know, rock and roll bands, arguably in history, Def Leppard. And I know that Steve was a huge Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin fan, so kind of following in those shoes, you know, in his footsteps. So you're basically having this incredible relationship with Steve at the peak and height of their success.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, they were when I met him, they were just coming off the Pyromania tour where they had crossed over at the pond and had international success, and now they were going to write the Hysteria album. And in most cases, an album shouldn't take, you know, it should take under a year, a few months to write. But this album ended up taking them 4 years to make because there was a lot of moving around. There was the accident with Rick Allen when he lost his arm in the car crash.
Yes.
So there were all of these big hurdles that they needed to go through for whatever reason. There was another point in there where their producer Mutt Lange had a car accident, and that set them back for a while. So there were a lot of starts and stops. So during those 4 years, we had a lot of hangout time and growing time. The other thing that was going on that most people don't know about was that these guys were tax exiles, which meant that they couldn't live in their own country for more than a certain amount of days a year. And so they were forced to live in other places.
I still remember watching on MTV and hearing about Rick's accident because I was a huge Pyromania fan at the time, and I was like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen? So two things stand out for me. One is how the band rallied together under really very difficult times and how they stood by each other, and specifically Rick, because he came back with one arm and they found a way to make that work. There was a lot of love with all of you in that band. There's no question.
There was a lot of love. They were a band of brothers. They were all growing together. You know, in those days, the band all lived together. You know, and so, and in a sense, they were forced to live together because the management, you know, wanted them to, you know, focus on the music, focus on the writing, and so forth. So they didn't really have individual lives until Steve met me and Phil met Valerie, and then everybody started, you know, and the other guys had girlfriends that they had from back home. And in any case, when I remember very, very clearly the night we got the news for Rick, on Rick's accident, because it was New Year's Eve, and we were the four of us. It was a break because it was the holidays, and we were the four of us in Paris. We were just getting ready to go out and have a New Year's Eve bash, and we got the phone call. And I wrote about it in the book, what we went through. I mean, heads hanging low because they thought the worst because, you know, Rick Allen had been in the band since he was 15 years old, and he, you know, as far as they could tell, he didn't know how to do anything else. He wasn't primed to do anything else. And so they thought that he would maybe, what they said in English, top himself, commit suicide.
Ooh.
That's what was going on. So they were really more worried about losing him completely than just him losing an arm or them losing a band member, you know. So that was the first thing. And then when they realized that he had such a will to live, they were just so grateful that he came back, and they were so inspired. And because they were so close to him and they wanted to support him, there was never a question of whether they would give him a chance or not. They didn't know for sure whether he could pull it off, but there was never a question of whether they were going to let him try.
So, Lorelei, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's continue the story leading up to the events with Steve Clark on that fateful day in January 1991. I'm Gregory Foster, and you're listening to Access Zen.
And now, let's return to Access Zen.
Hi, I'm Gregory Foster, and we're talking to Lorelei Shellist. So, Lorelei, fascinating story. I wish we had another half hour or an hour to continue with this dialogue, so I don't want to rush you or anything, but we've only got about 5 or 6 minutes left. So we left off with, the challenges, tribulations, and the tragedies that were going on with Def Leppard around the hysteria time frame with Rick. Take us through, a little bit deeper with the love of your life, Steve Clark, and take us up to that fateful day in January 1991.
Well, during that time, the 4 years of the making of Hysteria, like I said, there was a lot of downtime. And Steve, he was a drinker anyway. But, in the early days, I thought that we were just celebrating because we were constantly back and forth visiting each other, and so I didn't really notice how much he was drinking. And with all that downtime, he had a lot of time to sit around and drink when they were waiting for things to happen in the studio and so forth, and he was a long way away from home, and like I said, they couldn't live in their own country, and so they were living in Ireland, and they were living in Amsterdam, or outside of Amsterdam when they were recording Hysteria. So there was a lot of lonely downtimes, and during that time, he started to drink more and more. It took me about 3.5 years to realize that he actually really did have a drinking problem, that it was a serious thing, that this wasn't just a party attitude. And so I started trying to address that, and in my trying to address his drinking problem, the band didn't want to hear about it. He didn't want to hear about it, and so it created a lot of problems for us. But as it got worse and worse, finally other guys started noticing. The band management started noticing, so they sent him off to a treatment center. Mm-hmm. And during that time, I started to realize that I had to learn how to deal with his drinking from another point of view. Somewhere in there, I got involved in Al-Anon. And it was in the 12-step group that I began to understand that I could not control his drinking, and that I could only control myself. And it took a lot for me to really finally believe that that was my issue, that I had to take responsibility for how I was in the relationship as well. And this is the hardest thing, because when you're an Al-Anon person, you can't really see the problem. It's just it's sort of a dynamic problem, a personality and spiritual problem. And so it wasn't until he really hit bottom that I hit my bottom. Mm-hmm. And he went into close to, I think there was 11 treatment centers in the last year. I mean, it added up to 11 treatment centers by the time that he finally died. And it was before he died that I got my spiritual wake-up call. And I was over in Paris doing the collections, and I was in bed one night, and I just couldn't go to sleep, and I was just talking to God, and I was saying, God, why this? Why me? Why is this going on? Why can't I control this? Why can't I help him? Why can't I fix him? What is wrong? Help him, God. Please help him. Please save him. And I was just really having it out with God.
I hear you.
And I got the voices. I was, it was dark. There was nobody I could call. I was in Europe. It was the middle of the night. And I heard the voice of God. And that, for me, was my shifting moment. And the answer I got was, Lorelei, take care of yourself. You have to learn to love yourself. That was the message I got. And I write about this in the book. And so after that, it was like so profound. I was like, who said that? I just stopped. in the room. I looked around like, where are you? I know I can hear you, but I can't see you, you know. And there was a big shift in me, and then I really, really did succumb to the 12-step program, and I started to follow and really pray and really meditate and read the books, and that began my process of understanding alcoholism and understanding and having compassion for what was happening to him instead of being upset and angry with him, really understanding that the guy had a problem and that love could heal it. But I couldn't get near him to do that, and I couldn't tell him how to love himself. So when I finally got the call that he had died, I had finally left him at an AA meeting before that he died. And I felt very responsible because, you know, I felt like I had abandoned him, but I had to save myself. And I wrote about this in my book.
Yes, you did. It's all about personal responsibility and taking care of you, right?
I had no choice anymore. I'd learned that I couldn't fix him, only he could fix himself. You know, and it was his choice. You know, and then 10 years later, when I started to write the book, when the fans started writing to me, they had seen me on VH1 behind the music, and they discovered there was somebody out there that knew something, because everyone wanted to know, why would someone who had everything want to throw it all away? Well, the disease doesn't care who you are and what kind of car you drive and what band you play in. The disease is going to take you out unless you find a way to be strong inside yourself.
So true. So, Lorelei, we are at that time where we're just about out of time. So, a very engrossing story. I'm sure most folks listening to this will agree. So, thank you for coming on. What are you up to today, and how can our listeners find you?
Well, today I take all of my life experiences and I've turned them around in order to give back and be of service. And as you know, because we graduated together from the master's program at the University of Santa Monica, I am a spiritual psychologist. I'm a life coach and a counselor and an ordained minister. I do weddings and funerals and house blessings. Yes. And my website is Loreleishellist.com, or you can go to runaway.com, and you can find the book on either of those websites and learn more about what I do and how to reach me. I do free coaching sessions for the first time out, and I do my coaching sessions on Skype and also on the phone and in person.
Well, that is wonderful. I really appreciate you coming on the show today. Just a lot of really, really great, deep information you shared. Thank you so much, Lorelei.
Greg, thanks for having me, and thanks to all our listeners. Shout out to all the Def Leppard fans and all the Eagles fans and all of your fans. Have a great day, everyone. Love ahead.
You too. Peace to you.
Okay.
Okay, I'm Gregory Foster. You're listening to Access N, and it's been a really great show. Thanks to Lorelei. Thanks to the USM Prison Project. Make it a beautiful week. Take care.